War broke out in early August of 1914. There was a rush on the armories in order for men to join and enlist. 25,000 men joined across the country very instantly.
The attitude was good. Let's go and fight. Everybody believed that it would be a short war, and basically as soon as they reach Britain, let's say by November, well, probably the war would be over and then it would be time to come back.
This was a sort of profound moment in Canadian history where you have just an onrush of enthusiasm among individuals to join this Canadian Expeditionary Force. So as a result, many men are turned away. Initially, that expeditionary force, which is composed of about 30,000 men, they're first deployed in England, they're trained there by British officers, they're under British command. They're not deployed into France until 1915, and they don't actively come into combat until the Second Battle Leap in April of 1915. The first use of mustard gas, poisonous gas by the German military. 6,000 out of about 30,000 men casualties. It becomes clear to Canadian public, as well as Canadian politicians, as well as Canadian military officers, how dreadful, how horrific, how long this war will be. This is not the normal type of war which has been conducted in the past. And at that point, it becomes necessary to enlist more men to volunteer for the war.
One of the first things that started to happen was that the enlistment standards were lowered. And in August of 1914, you had to be 5'8" to get into the CEF. By November of 1914, the height requirement was lowered to 5'3". And the enlistment standards would continue to lower. They'd take in older men, less fit men, and so on, anything to feed the gaping maw of the war machine.
Toronto was a very British city. When war broke out and there was a general interest amongst young eligible men in the city to enlist, the Orange Order were at the forefront of promoting enlistment. The Orange Order were originally born in Ireland. They were a pan-Protestant fraternity.
Won't you gather round me lads and listen to your dad, for now my life is but a dying end.
They believed in the Crown, they believed in the Empire, they believed in the monarch. They believed in a vision of an English-speaking dominion. An early issue of the Order's newspaper, The Sentinel, for instance, had emblazoned upon it, "Orangemen enlist." And if you examine reports in the Sentinel newspaper for the weeks and months after August 1914, you'll see that the ranks of these lodges being depleted because more and more of their members were signing up.
You have to understand the context, the time of 1914. Life in the military offered a secure employment, as well as the pay was very good. $1.10 per day, that was the pay. But also just the sense of adventure. The opportunity to go to England, the opportunity to go to France, and to maintain and defend this idea of a British liberal democratic institutions.
Large numbers of workers didn't want to sign up. Out in the countryside, farmers were more skeptical. They didn't want to lose their sons, and they were quite concerned about the fact that there was a new demand for their products, but who was going to actually bring the crops in? And if their sons were taken away from them, this would be a problem. That had to be negotiated when the legislation came in. But there were also radicals in Canada who thought that this whole war effort was completely wrong, and that when you actually started to conscript people, you were moving along towards a very authoritarian model that was completely inappropriate. And the left in Canada really opposed conscription, particularly in British Columbia. One of the loudest and most critical leaders was a socialist by the name of Ginger Goodwin. And he decided to escape conscription and was chased and shot and killed. And the reaction was huge. Workers in Vancouver shut down for a day in protest against this, and there was a great wave, an enormous funeral was held for him, the great wave of protest that ran through the province.
When you compare the number of French Canadians who enlisted with other Canadians, it's true that French Canadians were quite reluctant to enlist, but there are a series of reasons for that. The army as an institution did not do much in terms of helping French Canadians to feel like it was their war. The army was still an English-speaking institution. And this is quite insulting when you're being told, well, you're supposed to fight, for the king, you're supposed to fight, for your ancestor. Well, guess what? My ancestors, when they came here, they spoke a language called French. These were, aspects that made it quite difficult for someone. Then what we know now, it's among all the Canadians who enlisted, well, the vast majority were, recent immigrants.
The great majority of the first people who signed up had British accents.
60% of the men who went in the first contingent were born in either Britain or Ireland.
Those, regardless of their language, French, English, those who had been in this country for more than a generation, they were reluctant to enlist because, well, the empire did not have the same meaning. Many French Canadians said, I prefer to work in a factory because, well, working in a factory, it's as valuable as fighting for a country.
During the war on the home front, there was growing concern about young women who seemed to be cavorting far too much with the young men in uniform, and also more seriously with the rising rates of venereal disease infection. When men were diagnosed with venereal disease infection, he was required to identify the woman who had transmitted the disease to him. She then became the target, subject to compulsory medical examination, and if found to be infected with the venereal disease, was subject to incarceration, compulsory treatment, and detention for an indeterminate period of time.